Okay, here we are at one after. So greetings everybody and welcome to the best practices for co-occurring disorders treatment. And today's focus is on staffing and training. My name is David Jefferson. I'm the Director of Training and Technical Assistance from the Northwest Addiction Technology Transfer Center. And I'm the moderator today and going to take care of a little bit of logistics. I'll introduce the training, then introduce our speakers today. So a few things, we have the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to, put in comments or some thoughts in there that you might have as the webinar is moving along. We're also going to use the question and answer box. So if you then end up having a particular question, please put it in that one, and that way we can kind of separate the two and make sure that we identify your questions. I'm going to try to propose those questions while we go along to our presenters. But if we don't get to them, we do have a question and answer period toward the end. So we'll make sure that that happens too. Folks are often interested in the slides. Those will come to you in about a week from now, sometime sooner. So next up, I'd like to talk about the TTCs. We have the mental health technical centers, we have the prevention technical centers, and we have the addiction technical centers. And these are wonderful resources. Chances are you folks are already connected with them, but if you're not, they're a great resource, and strongly suggest that you kind of do your Google, find them, and see if you can sign up to their mailing list. Amazing number of free trainings available to folks. Next is the other next. Thank you very much, Dina. Okay, back one more. There you go.
Yeah.
A lot of people are interested in certificates. You get a 1 CE for today's webinar. You don't have to do anything. If the email is correct that you used to sign in today, you'll automatically get that CE. But if you're part of a group of folks where you're watching together, please send us your name, the names and the email addresses of the people watching to this email address that you see on your screen, which I'll also drop in the chat box. And that way we'll make sure that those certificates gets to the people that need to have them. So next, let's talk about the training today. So this is a 5-part series hosted by the Great Lakes, Northeastern Caribbean, and Northwest Addiction Technology Transfer Centers and the Great Lakes Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. This is the 3rd in the series. 2 more coming after this. The previous one was organizational structure and service environment. So today we have our 3 presenters, and first off I'd like to introduce Dina Vandersloot. She is the co-director of the Northwest ATTC. She has provided dual disorder capability assessment, treatment, assessments, and coachings for dozens of providers in Washington and Oregon for over the last 10 years. She also has an amazing amount of expertise in motivational interviewing, integrated treatment, SBIRT, and the NIATEX process improvement. Next, we have Chris Kelly, is a Minnesota State Project Manager for the Great Lakes Addiction, Mental Health, and Prevention Technology Transfer Center, and a subject matter expert on peer-based recovery support services. She has worked with the state and local government organizations, recovery community organizations, recovery high schools, treatment courts, withdrawal management detoxification centers, and clinical treatment facilities, developing best practices for integrating recovery supports into systems and services. And we have Jill Blackson, is the Deputy Director of Community Care Services and is a master's level social worker. Jill has worked with families, children, and adults with mental health and substance use issues for over 25 years. She sits on the Beaumont-Taylor Teen Health Centers Advisory Board, the Beaumont-Taylor Substance Abuse Task Force, and is the secretary for the Families against narcotics. So we have a wonderful panel presenters here. I mean, not panel, presenters today. And with that, I would imagine this virtual handshaking. We're all going, yay, welcome presenters. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dina.
Hey, thank you, David, for getting us started. And welcome, everybody. Yeah, I was saying at the beginning of this, we almost need new salutations. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you might be. I wanted to start us off with just a little bit of an overview of where we've been, because I know some of you may be just joining us for the first time in this series, and where we're going. So our first webinar was really focused on looking and doing an overview of two different organizational assessments that look at dual diagnosis capability. One that looks at it within addiction treatment settings and one that looks at mental health treatment settings. So that was the first one, and the developers of those instruments actually spoke at the first webinar. And last webinar, we looked at program structure and program milieu. And today we're going to be focusing on staffing and training. And so how we have really structured these webinars is that we'll be talking about some very specific constructs related to dual diagnosis capability and talking about some various strategies for actually enhancing capability in those different areas. And one way to think about this, I think, that is helpful is it's just a step-by-step process. I was talking to one provider that David and I actually went to their facility and did a dual diagnosis capability and addiction treatment review. And she was just like, it's amazing. I think it was 4 or 5 years ago that we went to her program and the changes that she's made, but it's really been step by step. So we'll talk about strategies. We have Jill, who will be talking about within her program and organization, the strategies that they have done. And then we'll be taking some questions. So that's the plan. And the goal, I think, is that we're really hoping that you'll walk away with a few ideas and specific strategies to enhance staffing, supervision practices, and training to really build co-occurring disorder capability. We have put up this 4-quadrant model and just briefly talked about it during each of the webinars, just to remind people that we're going to be talking about different levels of integration, and that it's not always programs, depending on their population, may not be looking to have the highest level of fully integrated care. It really depends on your population. The program I was just referring to is a primary SUD specialty care, but they're trying to be kind of at the top of their game for providing integrated services for individuals who come into their program who are have a primary substance use disorder, but also have anxiety and depression issues and PTSD sometimes. So just keeping that in mind. And I wanted to show, this is a summary profile of a program who has received what we refer to as DD-CAT for the addiction organizational assessment. We refer often to the mental health one as DD-MUT, so when I'm using those acronyms, you'll know. But this gives you a picture of a program that is really dual diagnosis capable. And so for many programs, that's where they're really aiming to be. And the scale is on a 1 to 5 point scale. So at a 1, that's a program that is just really serves individuals who have substance use disorders or mental health disorders. At 3, it's dual diagnosis capable, and at 5, it's dual diagnosis enhanced. So it's a fully integrated program. And when working with different states and funders, there have been many that have really set the standard that they're hoping all programs are at dual diagnosis capable. So just a little background before we plunge in and start with talking about staffing structure. So when you're thinking about staffing structure for your program, there's kind of multiple components. And the first one is, do you have either staff or consultants who can prescribe medications? Medications for treating substance use disorder issues and for psychiatric issues. What about your clinical staff members? Do they have dual licensure? in SUD and mental health? And do those same people, can they provide clinical supervision that will include case review and mentoring? And then peer and alumni supports, how are those integrated? So that's where we're going to start today, at really looking at that dimension. So let's take a minute to talk about medication prescribing. The goal is access to a practitioner who can prescribe medication for both mental health and SUD issues for individuals with co-occurring disorders. And that really can vary depending on the population, and the location and time commitment from the provider. I remember I worked with one program and they had a prescriber, but one of the things that they were finding was that when their people first came in, sometimes they didn't have access to a prescriber for like 7 to 10 days. And they were sometimes finding that they were losing those individuals, the people were dropping out of services. And when they increased like how timely the access to a prescriber was, their retention rates definitely increased. And so when you're looking at this, and it's really, the degree to that access. So, for some programs, they have a contractor who's located offsite. Well, some have no formal relationship. So that's kind of one level. Although that doesn't mean that they don't try to refer and get people to services, but they don't have a formal relationship with somebody who can prescribe. Level 2 is you're seeing somebody that they may be off-site and some communication. Level 3 is really when you have a contractor who is located on-site, and maybe it's even one day. One program that we worked with had a psychiatric nurse practitioner, and she had a higher FTE in a different organization, but she committed one day a week at being this program where she would do interviews and prescribe and also participate in staff meetings. And then the next level is that you actually have a staff member who's on site who can prescribe and address some clinical issues. And then at the highest level, you have a staff member who's on site prescribing, can provide some supervision and participate in team meetings and maybe even look at some administrative issues. So we're really curious of all of you who are out there of when we're talking about this different levels of access to a prescriber, where do you fall? So I'm going to ask, we're going to launch a poll here and have you identify where you fall in that continuum. So if you take just a minute to type in kind of where does your program fall? Wow, it's looking like the majority of you have level 5. Yeah, and please feel free to type it into the chat box too. Thanks, Nikki. So many of you have almost the highest level. So this is helpful. I'll give it just another 30 seconds here. It's looking like that about 39% of you have it. And is this showing? Oh, okay, thanks. Or do I need to hit share the results? Oh, or do we have it, Meg? I think we do.
I think they're being shared right now.
Okay, thanks, Meg. Meg's our behind the scenes person. So yeah, this is really impressive, the number of you that actually have somebody on staff. So thanks so much. And many of you also, about 20%, have one who is on staff and available. So that's great, well, because it really does increase your capacity. So thanks for doing that. So what are some of the considerations? Well, patient need will really dictate the level of commitment from a provider. So really looking at, and all of these different elements really combine, because if you're doing screening and you're doing assessments, then you have the data to really figure out what level of commitment do you need from a provider. And if you have it, as many of you do, you probably notice that clients are much more willing to receive services if they actually have access directly in the program. And then the next piece that looking at really is, well, okay, so who, what role is the prescriber? Are they a primary care physician? Is it a psychiatrist? Is it a nurse practitioner? And, if you have access, of course, to a psychiatrist or a nurse practitioner who specializes in this area, then, as we get into talking about some of the training, there's so much benefit from that. I remember early in my career, I worked at a facility that was a dual diagnosis facility, and we had regular staff meetings with a psychiatrist and a psychologist, and the population we were working with had very high trauma. And so I know as a clinician, it was so helpful because there was this one psychiatrist who would say, okay, for this individual, it's really important for them to be able to talk about the trauma they experienced. This individual, it's really important for them to stay in the present moment. And so, there's just so much that if they can actually be part of the staffing and the team meetings, I learned so much from that compared to like training is great, but that on the job training is so valuable. And the other opportunity I think right now is that we have telehealth has expanded so much that access to prescribers and evaluation, consultation, medication management has really increased as a result of that, or hopefully. And I think there's some innovative things that people can do. So I'm gonna pause here and ask Jill to take a minute to talk about what her organization has done around integrating prescribers. Jill?
Hello. I'm sure for a lot of folks it's been challenging as it has been for us. We are fortunate that our medical director also is a prescriber for Suboxone. So he's been very instrumental in getting our staff familiar with what that program would look like, getting those policies and procedures in place, and being able to meet the needs of, unfortunately, the high number of clients that we have that are looking for treatment for opioid disorders. So we really have been working on building that program. And telehealth, obviously, in COVID-19 threw us for a loop. We had not been doing any telehealth except for a little bit through our outpatient clinics, psychiatric prescribers. But this particular doctor, when we did go off-site to provide telehealth, it was a challenge to do this with our Suboxone clients as well. And we had to get creative with making sure they got their labs, but also making sure that the clients were getting the therapy that we required as part of their treatment and receiving Suboxone. So we've worked really hard in making sure that we're maintaining that care for those clients during this time. And we've actually then brought on a nurse practitioner who also has done the training and is also a prescriber. So it's been challenging and slow moving, but something that we see as really important, and we're excited to continue to be able to provide that service for our clients. And then also having these prescribers on site has also really helped us guide our plan in going forward and how we want to provide these services in the future and how we want to grow that service within our outpatient clinic and getting more staff involved in the servicing of these clients as well.
Great, thanks, Jill. Your comments reminded me of the provider who's actually going to be at our next webinar. She just talked about very similar to you, bringing on a nurse practitioner and over time, and then bringing a physician who is, I think, still currently doing some residency. And her thing was that, we're slowly bringing them on and also giving them really freedom to help develop the program. And so, that added level of commitment when somebody is actually part of the development of the program. Thanks. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the composition of the clinical staff. With the clinical staff, it really is that you want a multidisciplinary staff team that is on site, that collectively have mental health, substance use, and co-occurring disorder expertise. And I think one thing I'd like to highlight with this, it is that co-occurring disorder expertise that is so valuable and Jill's going to talk more about this in a minute because, you know, whenever I do this presentations, I hear a lot like it's so hard to find duly credentialed staff. But I think that is so important because oftentimes, you know, it might be a substance use disorder program and they've hired a mental health practitioner to come on, which is great, but it takes time to develop that really understanding of co-occurring disorders and what are the interactions. And so if you can find one of those staffs, that's just so valuable. And so, you know, what are you looking for when you're thinking about hiring? Well, okay, so duly licensed should really be prioritized. And that person has at least 2 years of supervised experience in treating individuals with co-occurring disorders. And they really have the demonstrated capability to assess and diagnose, to determine treatment needs. Just like an example of a program that was doing this is that they actually found somebody who had this expertise, and they didn't have that person on staff, but they had the person come in and provide mental health assessments and some treatment and be part of the staffing team and even provide some clinical supervision. So I think you have to really be creative. Another person, they actually lived in a town where they had a MSW program. And so they provide practicums, internships for these individuals, brought these individuals on where they had an opportunity to be supervised by somebody who was duly licensed. And they only had one duly licensed clinician, but that person supervised these interns. And then many of those individuals then had both the mental health and SUD expertise and often ended up staying on with the program after they completed their degree. So just some ideas. So what about the composition of the clinical staff? Well, you know, the bottom line is that the more staff you have with expertise around COD, the more that you can actually effectively treat. And when we're using the dual diagnosis capability indexes, one of the things that we're looking at is like ratio. So like if there is one staff, you know, or percentage, but you have a staff of 4 and one of them has this, then of course, then, you know, it's going to be a higher level of ability to provide services. You know, if you have like 50% of your staff who have co-occurring disorder capability and can treat that, of course, you're going to go up much higher in level of integration. If you don't have the staff, then, you know, we talked last time about coordination and collaboration with external providers. So if you can increase that piece, you can increase the overall capability. I see something in the chat box about what a duly licensed clinician means. And, you know, I think that varies very much state by state. You know, in many states, it's 2 separate credentials. And so somebody has, you know, their mental health licensure and their certification or license around chemical dependency or addiction. It's referred to in different ways. And I think there is actually also some like co-occurring disorder credentials in some states. I don't think that's like across the board. So I think it just varies state by state. You know, another strategy to think about is, you know, really how can you help people who maybe, you know, doing some of the supervision and training to increase their capacity. And as hiring opportunities emerge, programs can integrate more diverse staff. So what are some staff development strategies? Well, one is, you know, being able to provide some of that clinical supervision by a duly credentialed staff on a regular basis. So having that person be part of staff meetings, and even beyond that, to really be able to promote in-depth learning. So let me give you an example of that. A program that I worked with was a very large mental health program. And for them, of course, you know, you're always looking at this as two-way. If it's primary mental health, they're trying to increase their capability to serve people with substance use disorders. So what they decided that they wanted to do was increase their ability of all of their clinicians to do screening and at least brief intervention to promote the person to be open to addressing their substance use disorder. So, you know, they created a training plan along with regular supervision and mentoring and implementation of, I think they were calling it whole person care because there are other dimensions of it, but you know, supervisors who can really help clinicians develop their abilities of understanding. Because, you know, as we all know, training is great, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, but people really learn when they have that on the job coaching and mentoring. The other piece is case consultations and reviews. And so thinking about when you're doing your staffing, are you looking at, you know, I was going to say both, but many times it's multiple disorders and a person's progress with the various disorders, their readiness for treatment, because you might have somebody who comes in and screens high and needs some mental health services, but they're not open to it. But part of that is that ongoing assessing readiness for services. So clinical supervision and case review and having people who can guide others is so key to this process.
Can I slow you down a second?
Sure, sure.
One of the questions was, do you know if there's a co-occurring disorders assessment tool?
Like for
doing it looks like doing a co-occurring assessment instead of an ASAM assessment or a co-locus assessment. Is there a combined tool that you know of?
I think there's many. The one that I'm most familiar with, and maybe Jill or others can speak to this, but the GAIN is definitely the one that I hear people using the most often as a truly integrated assessment tool. Are you aware of any other ones, Dave?
I'm not aware of any others, but the new TAP 21, I think it is, might reference something in there.
Oh, the TAP 42.
42, okay.
42, the co-occurring, it was just updated in 2020. Yeah, I haven't had a chance to dig into that yet, so that might be a great place to look. Thanks. And somebody put in here the ASAM, the new ASAM assessment tool. I think it does integrate it as well. I'm not as familiar with that, but thanks for that in the chat box. And with that, Jill, want to talk a little bit about strategies that you guys have done?
Yeah, I can, and I can speak to the GAIN just a little bit. That was something that we did start to look at, and then actually our PIHP, our funder, also wanted us to do. We did find that it involved a great deal of training and was quite lengthy. So I know on our end, where we're at, more in Michigan, they are looking at a different tool for that just because of the amount of training and time involved to even get your certification, so to speak, to use the GAIN. So I just kind of wanted to talk about that. So yeah, when we talk about, for us, the supervision of our staff and getting them ready, you know, you mentioned the whole person, and we also, like I'm sure most agencies now, are really trying to get our staff to address the whole person and integrated care. So looking at everything that client needs. But in doing that, we know that we have, while we're primarily a mental health clinic, we know that the vast majority of our clients also have an underlying substance abuse disorder. And some of our staff just are not very well trained in that. We also get a lot of new grads out of school. So they haven't had the opportunity to do a lot of therapy with those clients with substance abuse disorder. So we really looked at it about a year ago as an investment because we know that not having staff working also affects the bottom line financially. But we saw that in the front end, if we could get our staff, at least the beginning of the training for co-occurring disorders, that we were going to get the payback on the end, not only for our clients, but also in terms of the agency as a whole. So, we brought in the state to do some co-occurring training with all of our staff. And what we did is they kind of got a baseline where all our staff were at, because like most agencies, we have some staff that are probably on that enhanced level and others that not so much and are just starting out. And we wanted to be able to increase the skill level throughout the continuum of where our staff was at. So we invested in that training, and we have that training. And where we're at now with that is really that ongoing supervision piece. Our strategic plan calls for more training for co-occurring disorders, but it also calls for making sure that the current staff are getting the training they need. So we would have a newer staff work with their supervisor on really learning the stages of change, being able to address client readiness. We brought in also trainers for the state for motivational interviewing. We really see how those, all come together, and another tool for the staff to use. And we actually made changes to our electronic medical record that kind of triggers our staff to address the readiness and the stages of change that and where a client is at. So we have staff that are new, that are getting that supervision probably more often than some of our more experienced staff, where they're reviewing those cases, they're talking about that. We also address that in our ongoing chart reviews, that we can kind of pull some data and say, this person had obviously some things that might have been, should have been caught and weren't, and how can we make sure that we are looking for certain things with a client when we're assessing them. And then we have our staff who are, very experienced, but we believe in ongoing education and training for them as well. And that supervision includes the manager supervision, the one-on-one. And then we also, on staff meetings, will bring in cases for discussion, because we feel that everyone can learn from a case, whether you're new or whether you're a more experienced clinician with this. So we've looked at it from a couple different angles, and now we have also incorporated co-occurring training on a very basic level for all new hires as part of their new hire orientation, just to expose them if they haven't had much exposure, and then we build on that training from there.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Jill. I think there was a question in the chat box, and I don't have mine up right now, but Jill, about before you go away, Jill, about how you integrated or made adaptations to your ER to kind of trigger looking at co-occurring.
Well, so what we did is we basically just on the progress note put check boxes of where a client was at in their readiness. So we put that right into the progress note, so that at every progress note, the therapist has an opportunity to address where a client is at. And it was just a real simple kind of checkbox thing that we added into our progress note. And obviously we have electronic medical records, so we were able to work with our vendor and get that in there.
Great. So really a prompt for people to be thinking about it. And, when we're doing these kinds of organizational assessments, is exactly those types of things that really get it into the system. So it's not dependent on a particular clinician to do or to remember, but the system is designed in a way that it keeps people thinking about it. Thanks.
Yeah, and I would want to add real quick too, and this might be jumping ahead a little bit, but the other thing that we've spent a great deal of time on is really looking at our continuum throughout the system for us. So if a client comes in right from that assessment, really looking at, do our current assessments, the ASAM, the locus, and things like that, where should that client be directed into with a dual diagnosed client, a dual diagnosed therapist, or if primarily we see, a level of care that need for substance abuse that is perhaps higher, where we might have someone who comes in with their mental health diagnosis seems to be primary, but there might have been some potential for relapse that we're picking up on, and they would go with maybe a newer therapist. So we really look at that flow to make sure right from that client's first appointment with us that we're getting them into the right program and with the right clinician as well.
Yeah, great. So really matching kind of need with therapist and having that multidisciplinary with different levels of expertise and specialty.
Yes, knowing that we have a wide variety of skill level.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. That's great. Okay, I'm going to turn it over now to Chris to talk about integrating peer recovery supports. Chris?
Great. Yeah, thanks, Dina. I appreciate it. It's really exciting to hear all the conversation about readiness, because it just makes me think that that's a, sorry, my camera was covered, that's a key area that peer recovery supports can help. You can integrate peer recovery supports into your systems, and they're very well versed and skilled at working with people's readiness and helping to engage people into the treatment process. So if we look at the most basic definition of peer support, it comes from SAMHSA. And so essentially peer support workers are people who've been successful in their recovery process, who help others experiencing similar situations. And I highlight successful. So when we look at individuals, we want people who are thriving in their recovery and people who are connected to their communities and have their own recovery planning in place and are able to lead a healthy lifestyle and have a good quality of life. So just simply sometimes being in recovery doesn't necessarily make someone a good fit for being a peer recovery specialist. There's other traits that we want to be looking out for. If you didn't know, SAMHSA gathered a group of stakeholders in 2015 and through their brass tacks process developed a set of 12 core competencies for peer support workers. And those competencies are recovery oriented and person centered, they're relationship focused, and they're trauma informed. And they include things like building collaborative relationships, personalizing the recovery planning process, promoting leadership and advocacy, and then providing information about skills related to health, wellness, and recovery. And so those 12 core competencies really have created a basis for the actual work that peers do within our systems. So I like to take a look at the work of addiction researcher, Dr. John Kelly, who works out of the addiction medicine at Harvard Medical School, and he's the director and founder of the Recovery Research Institute. And so he puts the continuum of care for people with mental health and substance use disorders into a framework of looking at it like a burning building. So our current system really treats people, they're really good at extinguishing the fire. So they have a burning building. Our current system of care is really good at extinguishing that fire. And then we look at the other things people need, an individual needs in order to get and stay well. And so we need to prevent that fire from restarting. So that's our preventing a reoccurrence. And we need to provide the architectural planning for reconstructing their life. And so that might be in a comprehensive treatment plan or a recovery plan. And then they need access to new building materials. And so that's where we get into people's recovery capital and the things that are necessary when they're going to go and reconstruct their life. And then they also need rebuilding permits. And so if we think about things they need in order for the recovery process to begin, so many people with mental health and substance use disorders have had experiences that might prevent them from renting a apartment or getting employment or these other types of things. And so when I look at that continuum, I see so many places where peers are really well versed to come in and work with individuals. And so we can go to the next slide. And so I had mentioned recovery capital. And so both mental health and substance use disorder peers work with recovery capital. And so we think about the internal and external resources that people can draw upon to initiate and sustain their recovery. And so it really breaks down into these 4 different quadrants. So we look at social capital, physical capital, human capital, and cultural capital. So when we're looking at our social capital, that might be our family and friends. So do they have people, healthy individuals in their life who come alongside them and support their recovery? If we look at physical capital, that might be, do they have a place to live? Do they have a car? Do they have access, or do they know how to have a savings or a checking account? If we look at our human capital, we might say, do they have connections to job or career skills, or how to enroll in school or learn a trade? And then the cultural capital resides in our values, beliefs, and attitudes, and a way that we can connect to our communities, because we know when we're coming into recovery, a really important aspect of that process is is connecting to other like-minded people. And so this whole recovery capital process might show up in, like I said earlier, a recovery plan. And so there's actually a recovery scale and index through William White's work, more on the substance use disorder side, where peers can work with and actually measure someone's recovery capital. And I see a similar process for peers with RAP planning. And so on the mental health side. And so there's peers are very familiar with working with people's recovery capital. And a lot of those things fall outside of a traditional clinical treatment process. So these are the ways that peers can partner up and work in building up that capital, so that when somebody comes into an appointment and they're dealing with that readiness to change, they actually help to prepare people to make those changes that might be included in their clinical treatment plan. I think we can go to the next slide. So we talk about integration of peer recovery support. So I've had the opportunity to integrate peers into a lot of different settings and kind of document and review the process and figure out what works. One of the questions I think it's really important to answer is why we're thinking about embedding peers into a clinical treatment process. We know that peers offer living proof that recovery is possible. So the people that you serve see someone living a healthy lifestyle, and they're employed at your organization. And so all of a sudden that recovery becomes really visible. So a lot of times we're really invisible when we're in recovery, in the sense of we were incredibly visible when we were having symptoms of our illness. And so the people around us knew, sometimes law enforcement knew, sometimes our neighbors knew, family members knew. But when we come into recovery, that process isn't as visible. And so when we embed peers and let people know that peers are people with lived experience, that recovery becomes really visible. And that belief that recovery is possible is just a really easy way to connect with clients and show that the path that they're embarking on is really valuable and that they can do it too. Peers are really effective engaging people into care who might not choose to access it. And so it's very comfortable to sit down next to someone who's had a similar experience and share your fears and your reservations about the process. So again, when you're talking about that readiness process, peers can really work with individuals in helping them to be ready to embark in a recovery process. And then peers too have experiential knowledge of how to navigate our health and social service systems. And they know how to advocate within those programs. And then they know how to persevere when they're experiencing any biases or some types of discrimination. And so peers can walk alongside and literally go to appointments and really amplify the voice of the person being served, so they feel a part of and invested in the recovery process. And so on the screen, I just put some, on the slide, I put some questions that I think people should consider when they're thinking about integrating peer supports into their services. So you want to ensure that peer recovery support services align with your organizational needs, strategies, and policies. And so it's taking a step back and thinking, are we doing recovery-oriented work? Are we working on that? Is our work trauma-informed? And those things are really going to help guide the decision if you're ready to bring on peers. Definitely you want to have buy-in at all levels. And so you want the leadership of the organization to really be vocal about the fact that you're going to bring peer recovery support staff onto the teams and what their roles will be, and ask if people have questions and reduce any fears that might come up, that some places have fears that peers are going to replace or change clinical services. And so it's good to have conversations beforehand about what that might look like when you're going to bring peers onto staff. And then I would just do a simple pros and cons. What are some of the advantages and disadvantages of integrating peers into your services? And then include staff at all levels during that process. So from your front desk staff, your administrative staff, your clinical teams, and then your leadership, really to talk through that. What are the advantages and what might be some disadvantages? And then you know ahead of time before you bring on a brand new position, a brand new role onto your team, what those things might look like. And then you can provide education and training around those issues before the staff person's brought on. And then you're going to want to consider, are peer supports fiscally sustainable? So not all states reimburse for peer support. Some are included in the Medicaid benefit set. Are you receiving grants to reimburse or to pay for those peer support services? And are those grants on 2-year rounds or 5-year rounds? And what might that look like? And can you build a way for those peer supports to be fiscally sustainable? And then we'll go to the next one. So I always get a lot of questions about the supervision of peer support workers. And I was a peer supervisor for quite a bit of time in my former role, and learned a lot through that process. And I had developed the role from scratch, and so I had to do a lot of self-learning. And there's kind of 2 different forms. So within a clinical setting, you most likely will have a clinical supervisor overseeing the peer support staff. And so you just want to ensure that that individual has a thorough understanding of the peer support role. You definitely don't want to just have someone come to work one day and be told that they're now supervising a peer, especially if they don't know a lot about the role and what their day-to-day activities might be. And one of the ways you can do that is having that supervisor attend a peer support training. And so I was also a facilitator of recovery coaches, and had many supervisors come through our training. And every single one, when they were leaving, were so thankful that they came through the training, because they had a more in-depth understanding of what the role of the peer was. And so some peers in organizations start off more like what we might consider a tech or a residence assistant, or and meaning they might be passing medications, or they might be providing drug screenings and different things that a tech might do. And what we found was that when peers are put into those roles, it really challenges the peer recovery relationship. And so it's really thrown off balance, because the peers are inherently a non-hierarchical relationship. And so suddenly, if I'm passing you your medications, or if I am doing a drug screening with you, it really challenges the trust that's the foundation of that peer relationship. You're going to want to make sure the supervisor understands the philosophies and the principles behind peer support. Again, that it's recovery-oriented, person-centered, trauma-informed. I would use the 12 core competencies to help write that position description. So you before the person's hired, you're writing up your position description. You can base it off those 12 core competencies, and then use that as a tool. If it's a brand new position within your organization, use that position description as a tool for the supervisor and the supervisee to work together to see where they're meeting the requirements of their position, where they're exceeding those requirements, and where they might need some support. Some organizations I worked with, clinical organizations, found they actually had to break up the supervision role. And so there's 3 main functions. So you think of administrative, formative, and supportive. And so our administrative positions are going to be overseeing more of the schedule and payroll, HR, benefits, and that side of things. Formative is going to be someone who provides ongoing education. And so again, peers typically get a base kind of foundational training, and then they get certified by a state agency or a certification board. And so you want to ensure that they're maintaining their CEUs and that they have access to different types of trainings, just like we ask of our clinical staff. And then that supportive supervision, and that might come in the form of forming a peer group. And if you only have one peer within your organization, maybe you can seek out different organizations where you could connect them with other peers. And so we know a huge part of our job is being able to kind of decompress and talk through challenging situations. And so we want to ensure our peer staff have that opportunity as well. And then, of course, I think a role for a peer supervisor is going to be conveying the importance of the peer role throughout the organization. And I say that because in integrating and embedding peers, there can be bumps in the road and it can be challenging. And so we want to ensure that as a supervisor, we're helping to kind of back up that role and back up that new peer support worker, and that we are advocates on their behalf. And I think that was my last slide. Yes.
We have a few questions for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Specifically around training, as far as you know, are peers trained in ethics and boundaries?
Absolutely. It's a huge, huge part of our role, and there's many different ways to do that. So the foundational trainings, all the foundational trainings I've seen, there's a couple different national certifications people can go for. And like I said, a lot of states have approved trainings that might be approved by your Department of Human Services Behavioral Health Division. All the trainings include a ton of information around ethics and boundaries.
Okay.
Yes.
One person wanted to know, do you know about a recovery capital measurement tool? Have you ever seen anything like that?
Yeah, so I look up, where I would look is the work of William White.
Okay.
And so he's really, we kind of consider him like the godfather of recovery-oriented systems of care and recovery management tools, and it's free and accessible online. Okay. So look up the recovery scale and index plan. Okay. And then I would also advocate strongly that people use that scale as a guide so that you create your own for your own organization. And then what's really realistic. So again, if we're working within clinical settings, you have to look at, are peers allowed to work with people outside of the brick and mortar space? And that might kind of determine what you have on your recovery index plan. Okay.
One person was curious about wage rate for peers. What have you seen?
Yeah, it varies. It varies greatly across the nation. And so we see anything from probably the $13, $14 range up to $25, $28 an hour. And so I think it really depends on the place. Is it a reimbursed position? Is it a grant funded position? And personally, what I say and advocate for is making it a livable wage, mm-hmm. so that we retain our employees, and so that you know, we want to reduce turnover as much as possible, and providing livable wages is one of the ways to do that.
Right. And Chris, have you seen curriculum for peer-led groups for recovery?
Yeah, there's tons out there. And so again, I know in Minnesota, we use one called an all recovery meeting. So it's not pathway specific, meaning any pathway, including friends and family, can attend these recovery support groups. But I would just look for, again, what fits within your organization. So a lot of organizations work from a 12-step model. Others are spiritually based, so you could use Celebrate Recovery. If if you provide services exclusively to females, you could do Women for Sobriety. There's lots of different, or Smart Recovery, that's non-secular. There's so many different group meeting formats, and peers are really well versed at running recovery groups for people.
Okay. Well, the next two questions are might be a little bit more for the whole group. So I'll just pause there and see what's the next step for us. Dina?
Yeah.
Chris?
Yeah. Hey, Jill, I think since we're running a little bit short on time, I'm going to just briefly talk about training and then have you combine some comments about integrating peer supports and training. I know you already talked about training a little bit. So we'll do that so we can take a few questions. So the training piece is really that you want to ensure that all staff have the basic training. And so in basic training, if you're a SUD program, what about the attitudes? What about common signs and symptoms and detection and triage? So really, and it's all staff when we're looking and when we're assessing an organization. So does the front desk staff have it, receptionist, intake worker, have the basic training to be able to identify signs and symptoms and do some screening. And then part of the staff to really have the advanced training to provide some of the integrated treatment. And we're going to be talking about specific integrated treatments in our final webinar on webinar 5. And next time we'll be talking about screening and assessment instruments. So we'll go more into that. But the idea that, I guess the key idea that I would kind of emphasize here is having a strategic plan around this. And Jill, you referred to that when you talked in your comments before. Like, it's not just like, okay, we're going to kind of, I know of, it's easy to kind of like, oh, here, this training is available and this, but to really get clear and think about a strategic plan around enhancing your capability and to build in training and clinical supervision so that that training really gets implemented into the program. I think we're, one of the tricky parts, I think, is that there are so many different areas of training when you're talking about co-occurring disorders. And so, here just gives a smattering of them. So really finding out, because oftentimes we're approached as an ATTC about some COD training, and it's kind of like, okay, so what is it particularly? So I guess in just a minute or two, Jill, and maybe we can gather some questions. Or David, before because I do want to make sure we do respond to any questions. Were there questions specific to Jill that she could respond to in this part as well?
I think the rest, sorry about that. The rest of them, one was in particular, can we find statistics on the benefits of peer support? So some research.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would go to that site I mentioned earlier. So the Recovery Research Institute, and
Okay.
John Kelly has done some of the first real in-depth studies around peer support. And there's much more in mental health than substance use disorders. And so, again, there are out there, they're not robust yet, but we're getting there. There's more and more coming every day.
Okay, thank you, Chris. That was it.
So yeah, Jill, any kind of final comments?
Well, I think the common staff needs that you have listed on the previous slide were all things that we found we really needed to have part of our strategic plan. So, increasing the skill level of our staff for co-occurring disorders was part of our strategic plan. And then we had to break it down into the small bits. And a lot of those pieces are listed in your previous slide about how to write a good treatment plan, and also integrating a peer recovery coach, as was mentioned previously by Chris. And all of those are part of our strategic plan. And I think real important when you're looking at having a real robust, comprehensive, well-trained staff. And I think it's an ongoing process, because one thing I know was mentioned in here somewhere also was staff retention. So one of the things that we realized is that we're not going to ever probably be able to pay the highest for everyone. We're never going to be the highest payer out there, but we can have the best environment for our staff. And that became also part of our strategic plan, was our culture, our environment, and making sure that it's welcoming, because in our field, I think people will, they know the money's never going to probably make them, rich, but if they're in an environment and an agency that is supportive of the mission and vision, that can retain staff. So
awesome. That was a great wrap up, Jill. Thank you. So thank you, Chris, too, for all your comments. I think we also have in the slides, we have lots of resources available. And I think we ran out of room is there time for more questions? David, do you want to close us up?
Yeah, we got a couple of questions, but we also got to respect the time. It's at the top of the hour. And so a huge thank you to our three presenters today. Imagine this virtual hand clapping coming your way. Yay, thank you very much. You all were fantastic. There's some pending questions. We could see what we can do about answering those. And for folks, we'd love to hear some feedback on our presentation. You'll get an email tomorrow in the mail, but I also put the link to fill out our really simple survey, if you wouldn't mind doing that for us. And again, like I said, you'll get this tomorrow and you can fill it out then. And with that, your certificates are coming your way. Again, if you had more people in your room, send the names and emails. We'll get that to you. And then our next presentation is on September 23rd, and we're going to be looking at intake, screening, and assessment. And would love it if you folks could join us. So with that, thank you all very much. A very big thank you to our audience for your attention right up to the very last minute. So
Yes,
thank you
thank
all
you.
and see you next time.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.